Hmm. Welcome to the 13th Apex Workshop webinar. And today we will be talking a little bit more about the Visualforce. So it's been a long while since our last session. So we'll probably just start with a little bit of refresher of what we've done last time, because we created this Visualforce page with a custom controller, and we went over some brand new concepts. So what I want to do is just kind of review the page again, review the code we've created last week, or last session rather, and from there we'll take it off to some more work that we'll do today. So without further ado, let me share my screen. I hope I'm sharing the right screen. You should see my desktop at this point. And now my GitHub. Look, can you confirm you can see my GitHub?
I saw it a second ago. We are back on the splash screen.
Okay, yeah, let me just post it here so everybody can have the link to the GitHub.
There it is,
and
great.
I'll share again. Can you see my GitHub now? My gist?
Yes, I can. And
beautiful.
was able to get to the gist.
I'm sorry, what did you say?
Oh, I said, yes, I could see it, and I was able to get to the gist.
I think the breaking up is on your side.
Yeah.
Because you're breaking up too.
That makes sense. All right, just wanted to make sure it was me and not everyone else.
That's good, yes.
I'm going to go ahead and dial in, but go on without me. I'll be back in a second.
I'm guessing I know what you said. See you soon. Okay, so we created this page, and we reviewed really last session, right? So what this page allows us to do is to select an object from the object in this organization, and this list of object is dynamically queried from the organization, and that means that if you copy the code as it is to your org, any custom object that you created would also be visible in this dropdown. And once we select, we can see that before we made a selection, we're not able to select any kind of field. But once we make a selection, we can see that this second dropdown is populated with all of the list of the fields that exist on the object we selected. So on account, we have all of these fields. If I select, let's say, case, then we have case number and all these other fields that are case fields, of course. Right? So it's dynamically querying the list of fields, from the object. And once we are finally done with this, we can say, okay, from this object, let's query. To be honest, I usually work on the account here. So let's go back to the account just so that I know what to query. And we'll query by account type. And we'll say it has the word channel in it. And once I click the query button, we can see results of all of the accounts that have the word channel in them in the type field. And we can, the same thing, we can say instead of channel, show me all that have customer. And, when I click that, we can say that now we actually have customer channel and customer direct. And of course, if I type direct, it will see the subset of the accounts that only have the customer direct type. So very basically, we created a dynamic field that gets the list of accounts from the organization, gets the list of fields for the object that we selected. I'm sorry, not accounts, objects. Gets the list of fields for that object, and then allow us to query something against a specific field and see the results. So I think that the functionality is pretty straightforward. And let's look at how we did that. So before I'll jump into the code, what I've done today, because we did introduce a lot of new concepts in our last session, and I felt like I may have overshot it and gave too much new stuff in one shot. What I've decided to do is kind of break down how this controller works on a pseudocode. So for those of you who are not familiar with the term pseudocode, pseudocode is essentially a way to describe what your code does. So you're not actually writing code, as you can see, but you're pretty much trying to describe what your code does in simpler terms. And so let's look at what happens with this controller. So the first thing that happens, of course, the page loads. When we load this page, the first thing that happens whenever we run any kind of class, we have a method in the class that is called the constructor. And so the constructor runs first. What the constructor does, it populates a list of select options with all of the org object's name. So we created a list of select options, and we find all of the object names from the org, and we populate that list. In order to populate this list, we actually call a method that returns this value. And we'll look at the code in a moment, and we'll see exactly what it does. So by the virtue of asking Salesforce to give us this value, we're actually using a method that runs, and this it gets us all the data. And the next thing that will happen is that the user will make a selection of the object. So that is basically every time a user makes a selection, it makes a change in the value. When there is a change on the list of the value, or the value of the list rather, it populates a selection variable. So we have to have a place to store. This is the selection that the user made. And at that point, we also refresh the field selection section. So we then refresh this section. When the field selection section refreshes, it calls another method to get the object's fields and populate that into a new list of select options. Finally, the user selects the field and enters the criteria. And when they click the query button, it launches a query method, which utilizes dynamic query string, and returns the results in a list of sObject, including the field selected by the user. And finally, the page displays these results. So hopefully, it kind of makes sense. We first load the page. When the page is loaded, we first populate the list of values in this dropdown. Whenever a user makes a change in the selection here, it automatically will refresh this section. When it's refreshed, it will query for the name of the field, the available fields. And when the user populates the value and clicks the query button, it will then do the fetch and display the result back on the page. Before I get into the actual code, are there any questions about what I've described so far? Okay, I guess quiet is a good sign.
I've got a question, Ohad. So thinking about like how you build this, how much of the pseudocode do you typically know beforehand, and how much do you sort of figure out as you go?
That's a very good question. So generally speaking, I will already have a good idea in my head how to do this, but I don't necessarily know exactly the order of things. It didn't help that I didn't really know what I want the page to do until I was building it. We started with one idea and we kind of evolved. At first we just wanted to be able to query one object and dynamically get the field. And then we said, you know, if we're querying for one object, why not let the user select which object? We can make it as wide as possible and really create something that shows everybody what you can do. Because I think everybody that has gotten up to this session, you know, session 13 or 12 for the last one, already knows how to write a SQL query that will get all of the contacts, or a SQL query that will get all of the accounts with whatever criteria, right, by using the where statement. But showing how you can really dynamically get different objects and then dynamically build a statement for the SQL query that we run in the end, I think that's really where we kind of start seeing that, wait, we can do more than what we do as administrators with flows, for example. And so generally speaking, I will try to create something like this before I go, but it's absolutely almost always not complete, which means I will be adding a lot more. But at the very least, this helps me kind of understand how the control will flow and what are the order of operations that I need to do. Okay, so again, the pseudocode is hopefully relatively clear to everybody. And I would really like to ask that if anybody here looks at the pseudocode and says, why are you doing X, or why are you doing this or that, please ask, because this is the right time. Because once we get into the code, we'll actually be diving deep into each one of these steps. And what we want to do today is also start to look at how we write test classes for controllers that interact with Visualforce. So it's very important to me personally to make sure that everybody can follow through. And with that, let's go into the controller. So we have our controller here, and we see that as always, it starts as a public class called Object Query Controller. And this is a custom controller, and basically that means we can use that as a custom controller on the page. And we know that on the Visualforce page, we can basically call it by saying, in the Apex page declaration, we say controller for this page is this controller. And what that means is that whenever this page loads, it will instantiate this controller. And everything that we do on this page is basically relying on this controller. And so I define a bunch of different variables here, and I'm not going to dive into them yet. And we can see that I have a couple of different things here. I have a public list, and I have a few other methods here. Not that many. You can see that this controller is pretty small overall, about 82 lines of code, not about, exactly 82 lines of code. But what we want to start with is really the constructor, because you can always identify the constructor because it will have the same method name as your class. So our class is called Object Query Controller, and we have here a method called Object Query Controller. And what that means is that whenever we start this class, whenever we launch this class, in this case when the page is loaded, we're going to run this method. Whatever is encapsulated here runs. So with that, let's look at what happens when the page loads. We interact here with a variable called object names. So let's try to find out what is this variable object names before we identify what we're doing with it. So I'll use the search method, Control F, and I have here a public list. This list is a list of select options, and we talked about select options. Select options are kind of like maps, but they're a map that always has a string key and a string value. And those maps are essentially what we have to use whenever we want to create a drop-down list. So whenever we want to create a drop-down list on our page that is not based on a standard Salesforce pick list field, we have to populate a list of select options, and that's what the field will reference. So we create a public list of select options, and we call it object names. And you can see that we have a public get and a private set. So without getting into too much details, we did talk about getters and setters. And getters is basically what it means is who can get the value of this variable, who can try to read it. And set is who can write into the variable, who can set the value of the variable. So you can kind of compare it to a write or edit, create or edit, you can say, permission. And so the reason we have a public get and a private set is basically we're saying the page can access this and read the list of objects. But the user will never be able, from the page, to set the value of this list. to add a new object in the select list option. Is that pretty much clear? I assume the answer is yes. Okay. So with that, we'll go back to the constructor, and we're saying, okay, so now we know that object names is a list of select options. And we're saying that it equals, meaning we are populating, we are setting the value of this list to the value of init object names, which just by the virtue of the fact that it has those two parentheses, we know that this is a method. So basically we're saying we're going to now call this method, and whatever this method returns will go into this list of object names. So let's look at what happens when this method is being called. And so far, if we look at, yes?
Just to clarify, something that always tripped me up, or until recently, a constructor is really just a very specific word that describes a method in your class that's always going to run as soon as that class is accessed. Anything calls it. So in this case, the Visualforce page itself references the controller, and so every time the Visualforce page is opened, it immediately goes to our object query controller, and that immediately looks for this constructor and runs it. It's sort of similar to like when we were working with triggers, that as soon as you made a change in the database, it would go and look for a trigger for that particular object. So.
Thank you, Luke. By the way, Luke, your audio is still very much breaking up. So I don't know if you're using a phone or a computer, but you should probably switch.
All right, I'm running out of audio options here.
I can conference you in if you want. No, actually I can't, but thank you in any case for this clarification. So we are actually still on the first line that runs when this page is loaded. And let's jump to the pseudocode, and we said, okay, when the page loads, the constructor runs, and the first thing that the constructor does is it populates a list of select options. Now, where it gets the values is from another method. So by the virtue of us asking Salesforce for the values in this method, we're essentially running this method. So let's look at what init object names does. And lo and behold, it's right here. And we can see that's a pretty simple method as well. It only has 6 lines in it. And so we can see that, first of all, I'm instantiating a brand new list of select options. And nothing special here. You have hopefully seen this type of notation all the time. And then I also create a new list, and I call it entities, and that's a list of strings. And I'm using here something that is called schema map. And schema map is a beautiful thing, and basically is a variable that is available to us in memory, meaning I don't need to perform any SQL query to get the values. And schema map has basically the list of all of the objects in the keys. And of course, the values are actually the description of the object. So from the value of schema map, I can get later more information, like the fields in it and some more details about the object itself. But for the purpose of what we're trying to do now is just get the names of the objects. And so from that map, I'm just getting the key set. And so I started by creating a list of entities that has now each record in this list has a name of the object, of all of the objects. Of course, every string has the name of the next object. Then I sort it. Very important because they're not always sorted alphabetically. And we want it to be alphabetically so that it's easy for the user to find it. And finally, what I do now is I create a list. I populate this list of object names. And as I indicated, the select option, is kind of like a map. It has a key and a value. And so I have to populate the two values. And in this case, I just use both of them as the same value, which is the name. So essentially, the name of the select options is identical to its value. So in our case of the page, in this drop-down, there is the name, which is what we always see. And then there's the value, which is what, when I click on it, gets passed to the variable in Salesforce, in the backend, in the controller. In this case, both of them are the same. Both the name and the value are an account. And after all of this is said and done, I'm saying this method returns, I'm sorry, people are bugging me. Okay, sorry. And finally, we'll return this list of object names. And basically what it means when we return it, it means that this will now get assigned to this object named list that we used in our constructor. So I really want to stop and make sure that this whole concept of the constructor running first and of how we are actually calling this method and what this method does and how it returns the value back into this list. So this is the time where you have to raise your voice and ask me if you have any questions, or just, if you don't, just tell me you're good and let's continue. Okay, so quiet is, I guess, means everybody's okay with this. I'm very good with the very good explaining. Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Jennifer. Okay, so now we have a list of object names. I'm doing a couple of other things here. We have something called fields. So now let's see, wait a second, what is this field? It's a variable, obviously, because I'm populating some value into it. So let's look what fields is. So again, we go to the beginning of our class where I always like to define all of my variables in the beginning of the class. That's not necessarily how you have to do this. But we can see that we have a private list of select options called fields. And so for this, at this point, when we run our constructor, I basically say fields is now a new list. And what that means is that this list is empty at this point. Okay? But something else is happening on fields. Let's see where it is. Okay. Actually, we'll wait with that for a second. Sorry. So I just instantiated a new list of fields. That's all. And right now, there's no values in it. And then I also create a list of sObjects. And we call it results. And we just instantiated it as a new list. And finally, I also define a string called criteria. So now, we have all seen things like list of account, right? Or list of case. So, and we all are very familiar with the term sObject. But what you may or may not have known is that sObject is actually a type of object in Salesforce. And it's the very generic term to say, in this type of object, in this type of variable, I can put any kind of Salesforce object that I want. Any sObject can be contained inside this. And so I think it's pretty clear that because we really don't know what kind of object the user is going to select, we cannot instantiate a list of a specific object. It can be one of whatever, the 200 objects that exist in the organization. So instead of instantiating a list for every type of object that can possibly happen and then populating the right one, we just used this very generic sObject, and we are able to use that later to populate and display the fields from that object as well. Now you may ask, why don't we always use sObject and then always just be able to put in that list whatever we want? And so without getting into too much detail, there's some limitations when you use sObject. So you can't always just use sObject. And you also normally want to use know exactly what kind of data you're going to get. There's some memory considerations because sObject take more space in memory and so other things, so it can degrade the performance of your application. But for what we're doing, this is obviously the only solution we can use. We always want to choose the best solution for what we're trying to do. Many times there are many ways to do what we are trying to do, and some of them are more efficient than others. And so sObject is the the minimal option that is available for me to use. I can't use anything that is less complicated or complex. Okay, so now let's look at the page. Let's jump back to the page. And we basically know exactly what happens when the page is loaded. And if we jump back to our pseudocode, we basically know that the page loads, the constructor runs, this populates this list by running the method. And now it also instantiated a couple of other variables that really, at this point, don't have any values. So now we're going to jump into the page itself. And we can see the first thing that has to be in any Visualforce page is Apex page. And here we define, there's more things we can define, but for now I only define two things. The first one is what is our controller? And the second one I'm saying show me the header. And basically that means that when we look at the page, we'll see the Salesforce standard header with the tabs and everything. If I just change that to false and save it, when I refresh this page, we now don't have the entire wrapper of Salesforce. And we want to create an experience that feels and looks kind of familiar to the user. Okay, the next thing that pretty much always has to exist is Apex form. We are going to explain, as I've done last session, we're going to explain as much as we can through what these things mean in the Visualforce page, but really this is not going to be a Visualforce class in the sense of, hey, what are all of my options and how exactly do you form Visualforce? There are plenty of sources to learn about that. Obviously, Google is your best friend, but there are plenty of trailheads about Visualforce, and I would definitely recommend to start there if you're new to Visualforce and you want to learn more. But in essence, Visualforce is a markup language, which basically means it's based very much on HTML. It also means you can use a lot of HTML language on this in terms of the design and some other things, creating tables and whatnot. In Visualforce, whenever you create a tag has to have an ending tag. So for example, here we have a select list. And you can see that here I'm closing the select list. So this begins the tag and this closes the tag. And we also talked about the fact that sometimes you can actually close a tag within the same, within the creating tag. So this is an example where I'm creating a command button tag. And just by the virtue of me closing it with a backslash, I'm also closing this tag at the same line. So anyways, we can see that I created a page block, and I gave it a title, Query Objects. And the page block is this first thing that we see here, and we see the title, Query Objects. The next thing is we create a pageBlockSection, and this is what's defined by this line here that separates it from the page block. And I define it to only have one column. This is kind of where we also get a lot of the difference from the standard page layout. In the standard page layout, we can have 1 or 2 columns. Here, I can create 5 columns if I wanted. There's really no restrictions beyond what can be visually seen on the page. And I also give it a title called Object Selection. So we can see right here that I've defined this pageBlockSection, and it inherited some really interesting functionality. Salesforce gives us the ability to minimize pageBlockSection. You saw I didn't have to do anything in order to have that minimized functionality. And the next thing that we have here is a select list. So a select list is basically, as you've guessed it, this thing here. And I define some things. I don't give it any title. I say the size is 1, and the size really defines how many values I'm going to see here. So what's interesting here is that if I make the size, for example, 5, and I refresh this page, now this is no longer just a select list. I can actually see more records here. And now I don't have that ability to open this drop-down. But I'll change it to 1 because I do like drop-down for this function. And we also give it a value. And the value is basically saying, hey, for this selected list, these are going to be the values that you're going to present in here. Now, I'm sorry, I apologize. The value is actually where the selection is going to be stored. So in other words, when I make a selection here, this doesn't work because I made changes to the page. But when I make a selection here, Salesforce is going to store that selection in this variable called selected object. Finally, I go into this. You can see that this is a subtag of our select list. And I say the select options, the options that are going to be available in this dropdown come from this list, object names. And I think we've seen object names somewhere. If we go to the controller, lo and behold, here's object names. Sorry, I keep doing this. And then we also say we're going to provide something that we call that's called action support. Action support basically says I can do things that depend on events that happen on the page. In this case, I want to use an event that's called onChange. And basically, as you probably guessed, that means whenever a change is happening on the selection of this dropdown, I want you to do this, re-render something called field selection. And you can already see when I highlighted it, what it highlighted here. So re-render is something that we use very extensively in Visualforce because we want to be able to say, hey, when I make a change, I want to refresh a part of my page. In this case, if I would not do this re-render, when we make a selection, this section would not get populated with the fields. And finally, I also assign it an output label, and I say select the object you would like to query. And of course, we see that output label here. Any questions about the first section, pageBlock section of this page? Okay. So we'll go to the next section. This is where things start to get a little bit more interesting. Remember, when this page is loaded, Salesforce is getting all of the values that are presented here. So it's not like we have in the controller, we can say only the constructor runs. Salesforce is actually trying to get and display everything that is here. So now we're going to the next page block section, and this says select fields to query. And I also gave it an ID. I called it field selection. And this ID, by giving it an ID, I can now reference it from other functionality on this page. Specifically, here I'm using this ID as a reference for the re-render command. I also say in this one, I want 2 columns, not 1 like I had in the first page block section. I gave it a title. And we now go into this page block section. What is going to be inside this page block section? Let's see. Everything that we highlighted between these 2 tags that open and close it is going to be presented inside that section. And so now, the next thing that we'll show is a select list. And so you see that the first thing you see is a select list called select fields to query. Right? So we created a select list. Again, I gave it a size of 1. And I gave it a value of selected field. This is where the field is going to be stored when the user is calling it. Now this is interesting because now I'm saying the values in this list are going to be coming from this variable called object fields. And finally, I give it a name. Before I go into this, let's look at what happens when Salesforce says, hey, give me the values of object fields. So when the page goes to the controller, and that's basically, by the way, what happens. As Salesforce renders this page, It says, okay, let me go through this page. Okay, let me create a page block. Let me create a page block section. Let me create a list. Okay, let me find this variable. Is this variable accessible to me on the controller? And that basically means that it has to have a get and set defined. This is available. Great. Let me go here. Is this available to me? And so on, right? And so it's as the Visualforce page is being rendered, each line is accessed, and it's trying to, whenever we are referencing something from the controller, it's trying to get those values. So in this case, when I say, hey, give me the values of object fields, let's look at what happens. We notice that on the constructor, we have not really instantiated anything called object fields. So how does this have any value in it? Well, this is where it gets a little bit more fun. So first of all, we have defined object fields. I apologize. I keep doing this. Okay. So here we have a public list of select options called get object fields. Now, whenever we have something that starts with the word get, this tells Salesforce, this is my method to get the values of this variable. So whenever we have this get, we know that from the Visualforce page, we're not actually going to call it get object fields. We're just going to call it object fields. And so in the moment that the page is rendered and it reaches this line and it says, hey, I need these values to populate my drop-down list, the controller will say, okay, I know how to get you those values. Here is the getter for this variable. And so you notice that the first thing that happens is I'm clearing this list. If you remember, on our constructor, we instantiated this list as a blank list. But the constructor only runs when the page is loaded. So when the page loaded, we set this list to a new list, which means it has no values in it right now. And then when the page tries to render and get those values, the getter is running. Sorry, here we are. So the first thing, I'm clearing it. Now, the first time that we loaded the page, of course, it was already clear. There were no values in it. And so right now I'm using this thing called isQuery. If queried equals null, then queried equals false. Basically, I'm saying I don't want this field to be null. So if I don't know if the user has performed the query yet, I'll say no, he did not. And the next thing that I do, of course, system debug is not doing anything beyond just putting something in the debug log. And then I'm saying this: if the selected object is null, and of course, when we loaded the page, the user has not made any selection yet. If you remember from the controller, from the page, selected object is the variable that we store the selection that the user made in the first drop-down list. And so I'm saying if the user has not yet made a selection, I'm going to add to this fields list, I'm going to add just one select option. I'm going to say select object first. And so you can see when I load the page, if I just refresh this page now, the only value here is select object first. There's nothing I can do here. Right? Because the variable at this point, selected object, is still null. And I say else, meaning if it's not null, if the user has already made a selection, we need to get the list of fields. Okay, now before I go into how we get the list of fields, let's think about what happens when I make a change. So whenever I made a selection here, the first thing that will happen is the value will be populated in this selected object variable. The second thing that happens is the Salesforce is going to say, oh, I need to re-render this section. So basically, Salesforce is going to say, okay, I know that this section needs to be re-rendered. And when it asks Salesforce, hey, give me this list of object fields, it basically runs this method one more time. The getter runs again. So just by the virtue of re-rendering a section of the page, we're able to tell Salesforce, hey, I need you to go back and rerun this getter method. But now, our selected object is no longer null, right? I made a selection of account. So this selected object now has a value of account. And now I can start getting the fields for this account. And this is what we do here. So I have a system debug, and I say $, selected object. So it's basically going to say account in this case. So now I instantiate a new map, and I call it field map. And you can see that it has a string as a key, and the value is something we call schema.sObject field. So let's jump for a moment into the Salesforce schema class. So you guys are all very familiar with the developer documentation. And we can see that we have all of these different fun things here that we can do with the schema. So hopefully you guys have touched the schema builder before, which is really a UI to look at all these things. But the schema is basically the description of the database, which tells us, hey, which objects exist, some of the properties of this object, which fields belong to this object, what are the properties of these fields, hey, is this a string field, is this a number field, is this a pick list? Those are all things that are defined in the schema. And so we're creating something called schema.sObject field, which is, as you can guess, is basically the definition of a field. And we're saying get the selected object, in this case it's going to say account, dot, and then we use something called getDescribe, and we'll look at in a second in how it looks in the method in the documentation, and dot fields, and finally I say dot getMap. So I'm actually, all of this thing is just going to give me a map that has a string for the name and all of the list of all the objects for that object. So if we look at the documentation, schema map getDescribe. So this is actually, we need to jump into something slightly different. Let's search for schema map. I find that it's a lot easier to do it through Google. Describe field results. This looks like a good one. And so we can see here that, well, this is probably something we use actually later. I'm probably doing a pretty bad job here. Let's say schema map getDescribe. Okay. I'm doing a bad job at finding this. Okay, so for now, I'll kind of just explain what it does. Basically, we know that schema map is available to us in memory. And I'm going to ask, hey, schema map, get me this account object. And then I'm using a method called getDescribe, which basically I'm saying, I want to get some information about this account object. Specifically, I want to get the value of the list of the fields as a map. And then I basically do a simple loop that iterates through the values of the field map. And all I'm trying to do is get two things. I'm trying to get the API name and the label of each field. So in order to do that, I do have to use the describe field result that I just found through Google. So I basically say for each field in this result, I need to do another describe action to get these two values, something called label, which is label, and the name for the API name. Finally, I put that in a new map, field API name map, and I add it to fields. So what we end up with here is fields, which fields, if you remember, is a list of select options, which basically means we're just going to use this to show the values in the drop-down list. And so I'm saying into field adds a new field, a new option that has the name, both for the name and for the value. So in our case, when I load this page account, it will say that the first field is account ID, the value is also account ID. The second name is deleted, value is also deleted. But I'm also creating a map that I will be using later that says for this field name, this is the API name. And finally, I return these fields to the page to show in our drop-down list. So I think this is a little bit where it gets a little bit more complicated. I would absolutely like you guys to stop me and ask me any questions. Maybe I'm over-explaining it. Maybe it's clear to everybody, and in that case, I would also like to know. Just tell me keep going, or just tell me, hey, you need to delve more into this. Okay, everybody says keep going. Thank you. So now we get to the next section, right? So now we populated the fields in this drop-down, and the user is making a selection. Now you'll notice that on the page here, sorry, again, I always do this. On the page here, I don't have an action support here, meaning when the user makes a change, we're not doing anything with it. We're just going to pass this to this selected field variable, but we're really not going to do anything with it yet. We then can look at these two other things that we have. The first one is the command button. Now keep in mind when we are looking at the Visualforce page, if you remember, I defined this as a pageBlock section with two columns. When you populate your presentation here, you always populate the first row first, and then the second row, and so on. So it's a little bit counterintuitive. You don't do this one, and then this one, and then this one, but rather left to right, left to right. And so the first thing that we had was our select list. The second thing we have is our command button. Command button is a pretty straightforward Apex tag that basically creates a button. I define an action that I say, hey, when somebody clicks on it, you got to run this method. And also I wanted to re-render something. We know what re-render is, basically refresh. And it passes also, it has a value, which is the value is really just what will be displayed on the button. And you can see it says query exclamation point. That's what we see on the page. And finally, I just use a simple tag called input text. I give it a value, and I say criteria. And this basically means the value that the user enters will be stored in the criteria variable in our controller. I give it an output label, and I close it. And that's the end of our pageBlock section. So we load a page. We populate this with just one value. When the user makes a change, we re-render this section altogether. And at that point, the page asks Salesforce again, give me this list of values. Because we already made a selection, Salesforce, our method now knows that it needs to get the field for the object selected and return them to the page. And that's basically how this is rendered now. Once I make a selection here and type something here and click the query button, the next thing that will happen is it will run this button perform query method. So let's look at what this method does. So as you can see, by the way, from the controller so far, we've already gone through the getObjectFields method. We've gone through the object query controller. This is the constructor. We've gone through the init object names. And finally, we're now going to look at the last method, which is button perform query. And in order to be able to query dynamically, meaning I don't really know what field the user is going to select, so I can't create the so-called query in advance. What I'm doing, I'm using something called dynamic SQL query. Instead of actually selecting using a select and populating into a list, I'm building a string. So you can see I defined here a string called query string, and I basically hard-coded into it some statement. I say select ID, name, created by name, created date, last modified by name, last modified date, and then I'm adding something dynamic to this string. I say also get me the field API name for the field that the user selected. And this is where we use this map that we created in our previous method. And finally, we continue this string and we say from, and again, we use this dynamic variable to say from the object that the user selected, in this case, account. And I say where the field that we selected, again, is like the criteria that the user entered on the page. And the criteria is, again, a variable. Does anybody know why I'm using this slash here, that forward slash? I'm going to give somebody a second to type in, or you guys can talk up if you want as well. Okay.
Hello. I think it's to denote that it's a string variable.
It's what? I'm sorry?
It is to denote the string variable, right? A string will be counting in that position.
The forward slash, I couldn't really hear what you said, I apologize, but the forward slash basically what it means, you say to denote a string. The forward slash is basically saying, is something we call escaping. And whenever we want to use restricted string, or restricted characters rather, inside a string, we need to be able to tell Salesforce, hey, I'm not actually closing my string here, right? Because you'd expect, that every string that I write here starts with this single quote. Here, I want this single quote to be part of my string that I'm going to pass into the controller, into the SQL query later. And so just by the virtue of using this forward slash and then this, quote, I'm telling Salesforce, even though this is an end quote, this is not actually ending. Use it as a string, as a character in your string. And so I'm saying like, open string percentage, and then this is actually closing this part of the string. So all of this is going to be inside the string, and then I'm closing it, and I'm saying now add the criteria, and I'm doing the same thing to close the quote. I also get this field here for some reason. I have the selected field API, and then I'm debugging this string. So let's see what it looks like. When I click query, let's look at our debug log. Now keep in mind, when a Visualforce page runs, every time you do something on the page, it's a separate log. So that means when we loaded the page, it created probably this log. Then when I clicked on selected the object, it created this log. And finally, when I click query, it created this one. We'll actually look at that in a second. So let's filter out to only look at debug statements. And we can see here is our select statement from line 76, right? And our select statement has select ID, name, all of these things that are hard-coded. And you see the type is here, which is the field that I selected, from account, which is the object we selected. And here we have this like, open quote, percentage, customer percentage. So that means percentage is basically a wildcard. We're saying where customer is anywhere inside the string. Right? It's kind of like saying contains. If I had percentage only before, it would say something that starts with whatever and ends in customer. If I add percentage only after, I would say something that starts with customer and has whatever between afterwards. If I say it's between percentages, I say it can have anything before and anything after, but it has customer somewhere inside it. And finally, we continue through our controller. I use something called database.query. And to that database.query, I can pass a string that has a SQL statement. So this string that we built here is now being used to actually call the database and perform a SQL query. Now, if you remember, results was that list that we instantiated in our controller that was, at that point, empty. So we populate the results. I put the debug statement with the result size, which basically says, hey, we got 10 results. And I change this variable called queried to true. If you remember, we set it as false in the beginning. Now, this is something we haven't really noticed before. But when we loaded this page, let me do something here. Let me clear out all of these debug statements, and let's load the page from scratch. When I load my page, you notice that it doesn't even show the section for the results, right? We can also see that it created one debug log. If we look at the page, we get to the next section. And here we can see that it has pageBlockSection, title, results, blah, 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 blah. And we have something with it called rendered. And rendered basically says to the Visualforce, if this is true, I want you to show this element. If this is false, don't even render this. Don't even show it on the page. And because we started by saying queried is false, then when we load the page, this pageBlockSection doesn't even get shown on the page. Once we click the query button, we change that to true. And if you remember, we also had on the button, we told to re-render. So now it's re-rendering this entire section. And this time, queried is true, so it's going to show that section which it didn't show before. Then we use an element called pageBlockTable. pageBlockTable is just like this, what it seems. It's a table. It automatically creates a table. And it expects a list, some kind of a list, to be able to repeat all of the values and show all the values in this list. So to this table, I have to give it a value of some list. In this case, it's our results. And I'm going to give it a variable. The variable is the value, just like in a loop statement where we instantiate some variable to reference inside the loop. This is the same thing. R is going to be the variable we reference inside the table for each row. So now we look at what columns I'm going to display. I'm going to show the ID. I'm going to show the name, the created by name, the created date, the last modified, blah, 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 and the selected field API, which is why we had to populate this thing here. So now we have the API name also in a variable, and we can show that variable on the page. Now, this notation is actually a little tricky. Normally, we would use just something like this, r.id, r.name, r.createdby. The reason we have to use this weird kind of notation is because we actually used this sObject type of object, and it behaves a little bit differently. So just keep that in mind. Again, I'm not going to go into a lot more details, but this should pretty much be straightforward. Then we close the table, we close the section, we close this output panel. I'll touch on the output panel one more time quickly. We close the page block, we close the form, and we close the page. And so we can see that first debug log that was created when we loaded the page. When I make a selection here on account, you can see another debug statement was created because the page actually went back to the controller and told him, hey, I needed to get those object fields. And finally, when I type here customer or whatever it is, and I click query, it goes back to the controller and it created another debug statement for us. So if we look at this, in the first debug statement, in the debug log, you can see that the only thing that happened, the page loading queried is false. There's really no other debug statements that got created. And the second time, we get a little bit more. We get this page is false, but I also debugged the I put a debug statement with a selected object, in this case account. And of course, in the last one, we've already seen it. We have some more debug statement, because this time we actually performed the query method. Okay, so this was a mouthful for me. This is pretty much puts us where we stopped at the end of the last session. I'll stop one more time and I'll ask if anybody has any question. Any comments? Luke, do you have anything to add? You even have Luke on the line.
I'm here. I just think my headphones probably have a short circuit in there somewhere, so I've been sticking to chatting if necessary.
Okay. Well, it looks like everybody is pretty happy with it. So the next thing is great. We created now a controller that that has this wonderful functionality. If you'll notice, I like to add, and this is something that I like to do when I write code. I always have a list of these to-dos. And I say, okay, it's great, I created this thing, but I also want to add more things. And as you write code that takes you days or weeks to write, it's very handy to just keep here, okay, I just finished adding this method, and I can remove it. So usually as I start writing my code and I identify the methods or what is still missing in my code, I'll just add it here in my to-do. In this case, I used it to say, okay, these are things we can now enhance in this page. So let me show you something interesting. If I go here and I change this to, let's say, create a date, or anything that is, let's say, created date, and I say here something like 1/1/2017, what will happen is we get an error. It says duplicate field selected, created field. Why is that happening? Because when we constructed our query statement here, we already had created date here. And now we also try to add it here from the user selected field. So we're basically creating a SQL statement that has the same field twice. So that's not good. We want to be able to handle that. Oh, sorry. Let's do something else. Let's select account. And let's select account number. No, let's say some other field I'm not querying. Employees. And I put here 5 or 4. I get another error saying like operator is only valid on string fields. So basically what it tells me, number of employees is a number field. I cannot use a like statement on a number field, right? So our query statement is very, very aimed at text fields right now. So in my to-dos, I said, okay, let's make sure we can handle the error when user selects ID or name fields to query, or really any duplicate fields. Let's make sure we can handle queries of fields that are different than text. Let's allow the selection of multiple fields. It would be great if the user can say, hey, I want to query more than just one more field. We'll also be adding the ability to do a mass update. And finally, we'll also create the functionality to insert new records. So these are all things that we will end up doing with this class, not today. But as we go forward with the next few sessions, we'll be adding all of this functionality to this page. So what we are going to do today is we're going to start to look at how do we test something like this. So I know I'm talking a lot today. I don't really have right now yet a lot of exercises, but we will get to some little bit exercise in code writing when we get into the test class. So hopefully you already copied and created these classes and Visualforce page in your organization. If you haven't, this might be a good time to start that. But let's start to look at the test class. So you already have written so far a lot of test classes, and you know how a test class look. But before I even start to go into the test classes, there's two things we need to understand. Controllers abide by any other Apex code coverage requirements that you have already seen. And what that means is that just like any other controller, any other trigger, or any other class, you have to have code coverage in order to be able to deploy this to production. The second thing that we need to know is that Visualforce pages don't actually require testing. So you can deploy any Visualforce page without any test classes. Of course, if the Visualforce page has a controller and you have not deployed the controller yet, or deploying it in the same change set, the deployment will fail because it will say, hey, you're asking for a controller that doesn't exist. Just give me 1 second, people. Right, so Luke is making an observation here. Generally, you will always start by creating the class. You can't really start creating the Visualforce before you have the class, because the first line you try to write when you say controller equals to object query controller, Salesforce will already give you an error and say, hey, this controller doesn't exist. If I just change this to 2, we'll see a problem appear momentarily. And it says Apex class object query controller 2 does not exist. So general guidance is always you start with the controller. The same with every other thing, by the way. Everything that is inside a curly bracket in the Apex, in the Visualforce page, references something in the controller. If I try to do this before defining a variable that has a getter and setter, a public variable that has a getter and setter, the Visualforce would not be able to see it. So if I just went here to this, which one was it? Selected object, and I change it from public to private. Private means it's only available within this class. You'll see something interesting here saying that this variable is not available. And it says unknown property selected object. And it doesn't mean that this variable does not exist in the class. It just means it's not available outside of this class. And so this page does not have access to it. So we'll change that back to public. And we should be able to save this now successfully. Okay, so with that known, how do we test a controller for a Visualforce page? So I'm going to start by defining it, declaring it as an isTest, of course, giving it a name, and having the constructor of the test class. And in this case, I'm going to start by preparing some data, right? We always start by preparing some data. I'm going to prepare data so that we can query it. The metadata is available in test, so we will not need to, we will be able to query all the objects, right? Things like object names, fields, all of this is metadata, and that you don't need to do any kind of preparation. It's already available to you. So I'm going to start by creating a list of accounts, and then I'm using a loop. I'm saying first we will create some accounts with account type equals customer direct. So I'm looping here from 1 to 6, and I'm saying create a new account. The name is test account direct plus the number of the iteration that we're in. Type is always customer.direct. I'm adding it to a list, to this list that we defined, account to insert. And I'm adding a debug statement to say, hey, I just created this account or added it to the list. Then I'm also creating another list, and I'm creating more accounts. And here I'm saying integer I1 to 4. So I created 6 accounts here with customer direct. And basically I'm doing exactly the same thing here. And this time I'm creating 4 accounts where the type is customer-channel. Okay? And I'm adding it to my list. And finally, after I added 6 plus 4, so 10 accounts into my list, I am now inserting this list. And you can see the system debug statement, of course, here is showing how many accounts we're going to insert. So this is all pretty straightforward. Any questions on this? I don't expect it. Okay, so now that I've prepared all of my data, I'm going to start my test. Now we have a bunch of accounts and we can start testing. By the way, this is the actual type of notation that I like to put in my code. I really like, in fact, I already know that I missed here customer channel. I like to have notes that are really, really detailed and make it very easy, because most of my classes that I write have hundreds of or thousands of lines in them. And if I have to go back to a class that I wrote 2 months ago, I can promise you I have no clue what I did. So these notes normally save my life. Finding the area that I'm trying to change or update or fix a bug just using these notes. I keep saying that. I said it, I think, since session 1. But I cannot stress enough how much notes will save your life. Get used to noting and putting as much as you. There's never too many notes. That's really the bottom line for me. Okay, so we inserted our accounts, and now we have a bunch of accounts, and we can start testing. We will start by creating an instance of the controller. So in order to test this controller, we have to basically call it. And so we're basically saying object query controller. This is the name of the class. I give it a name. And I say this is a new instance of this controller. Now, what happens when we do this is something very interesting. Just by the virtue of me instantiating it, it already calls the constructor. So we already know what happened just by me doing this line. It already ran this constructor. In order to provide coverage, we need to ensure that as much of our code as possible will get executed. Since we are not going to have the page open and someone pressing the buttons, we will have to simulate them by calling the methods that they invoke. So anything that this page calls, like the object names or this button perform query, we basically just have to call that from our test method. So the first thing I'm going to say, I'm going to set this select object to account. Right? We cannot really ask any user to make a selection. So we'll just hard code it to account in this case. Now what I could have also done already, I could have made sure that I could have already done a system assert not equal to say that the object field's size is more than 0 or not equal to 0, right? Because I should know that by the time I instantiated it, the constructor ran, and I already know that I have not object fields, but rather, what did we call that class, that variable? Object names. So in my test class, I can even, right here, I can even test system.assert not equal. And I can say objcon dot obj names. It was right there for me. Now the reason that I'm using not equal instead of equal is because really when this class runs, I have no clue how many objects are going to exist in this organization. If somebody created a custom object tomorrow and I try to run it again, this number will be increased by 1, of course. I'm saying make sure it doesn't equal to 0. And this should already pass. And then I'm setting this to account. And I'm doing another assert. Again, just by the virtue of me selecting this, I should already be able to see that it has more than one value. Does that make sense? Okay, I'm going to comment the code that happens up to here. And let's run this test. Oh, it didn't save, I'm sorry. Method does not exist or incorrect signature. Oh, not equals, where is it? Okay, now I'm getting another one. Oh, I'm sorry. Again, I did object names. Need to do dot size. Okay, so now we can run this test. It's success, and let's see what we have here. Just ran successfully. This one was the one that I canceled because of this bad save. And it's completed successfully. What we can, of course, do is we can go into the log and we can see the test itself. Use our debug log, and we can see that we created those accounts. And then we can see the page is loading. Now, why is it saying the page is loading? This debug statement is actually happening during our constructor. So you can see that it's already there. And we can see we also set that $$ account, which is also in that get object names. So just by doing these two simple things, I was able to now simulate both loading the page and setting the account. But we have not simulated the query yet. And if I look at my code coverage, you can see that I'm already at 72%, right? And so we can see that these have not been referenced yet. All the red lines have not been called yet. All the blue lines have been tested, right? So we see that we don't have selected object as null because I never really queried the object before making the selection as account. So let's see if we can figure out how to get coverage for this line as well. And we can see, of course, that the button perform query has not been run yet. So let's review our code coverage. At this point, we obviously got to 72% coverage. So let's say this. We have a to-do now. Add code to ensure that line 21 to 22 are also covered. And in this case, those are, I moved some things because I added a to-do, I apologize, but it's really this. How do we make sure that this line get covered as well? So at this point, I'll give you guys a couple minutes. If you haven't put these classes in your code yet, in your org yet, in your dev org, please do so. And let's just try to make sure that whatever we need to add here, to make sure that this line here is covered, our null section. And I will give you guys 5 minutes, and then we will do this together. Before I give you this time, any questions? Luke, any comments? I like quiet.
Nope, no comments.
Thank you. Great. So I'll give you guys 5 minutes, and then we'll do it all together. We'll meet again at 8:28 Eastern. Okay, we're almost at 5-minute mark. Anybody made progress or anybody has any questions? Has anybody been able to get coverage for line 29 in my current code?
I'm actually getting an error just when I run this directly from the code in GitHub.
Mm-hmm.
And it's happening with the button perform query. And let's see, I just ran a test again now. Let me see if I'm still getting the same error. I'm getting an unexpected token, null, from the values we provide for the button control, and when it hits the query in the class.
So is that happening in your when you run the test?
Yeah.
Okay, so why don't we try to comment out the same section that I commented in the test class right now, which is lines 52 on my screen through line 53 through line 60. Try to comment that out and see if you are able to run your test successfully.
All right. I think that corresponds to lines 49 through 53 from the GitHub gist.
Yeah, that's because I added that extra comment line and that extra system assert not equals.
Yeah, commenting those out does allow that then to function.
Okay, great. So I'm guessing we might hit the same error when I uncomment these. Has anybody else gotten the same error? Has anybody been able to run the test successfully? Let me ask you this. Is anybody actually doing this in the org? Because if you're not, I can just continue and I don't need to wait for you to fictionally do this, this exercise. Okay, nobody's answering, so I'm guessing nobody's actually doing this in their org with us, which is actually okay, but that means we can continue with our review. So right now, as we've discussed, we're not covering this. And the reason for this is, as you may hopefully be able to guess, is that there is no scenario where we're getting getObject fields where this is null. Right? So what is a quick way to get it fixed, to make sure that we get this with a null value? We'll just set it as null. Okay, so let's try that. Let's write obj.con dot selected object equals null. And I can actually use the same system assert here. How many do you think, what's the size that you think I will get with this null value? How many should I expect to have here? So I can actually do assert equals, because we'll get a very specific number of fields in the result when the object is null. If you remember, we said if it's null, we're just adding one field. So my expectation is that whenever this selected object is null, I will only get one field in the returned results.
It works.
And so let's run this test now. And let's look at our coverage now. And now we got up from 75 to 72%. And lo and behold, we now, The interesting part is that in the test, just by the virtue of me calling a system assert on getObjectNulls, on getObjectFields, this statement by itself runs the getObjectFields method. So your system assert actually allows you to run your code in this scenario. I could have just as easily created a new list of select options test fields equals to obj_con dot getObjectFields. This, if I commented
your list,
we're still now calling that method.
Selection options. There you go.
Sorry, thank you. I always do that. So just by using this, I'm also now calling the obj_con. I mean the getObjectFields. I'm sorry, getObjectFields method. But I don't even have to do that. I can just run the system assert, and that by itself will also. In fact, you know what? Why don't I try that? I'll show you that. Bullet type select option. Select option. Oh. And if I run this, I expect to see exactly the same coverage. Woohoo! I like it when I'm not wrong. Okay, but again, just the system assert by itself, by the virtue of it trying to get the values of this list, is actually causing this method to run. So now, let's test the querying section. Let me comment out this section that I just commented in. Always make sure when you put a comment section with a \**, always remove the end of it as well. Let's try and run this, and we'll see if we get the error you got earlier, Luke. But let's see what we're doing here. We're setting up a selected field. Excuse me. We're setting up a criteria, which is basically the equivalent of the user selecting this here type, account type, and the criteria, typing some criteria, right, customer. So that's the same exact thing, because those values end up going from the page into these fields, right? And then I actually call the button perform query. And I want to make sure that I got exactly 5 accounts, because I'm using this direct state query, and we know that we inserted exactly 5, I'm sorry, not 6, because it's from 1 to 6, so it's only 5. We only inserted 5 accounts where it's customer direct. So if I run my test now, let's see what happens. Ooh, we have a failure. Let's look at our log. Unexpected token null. So that's a great error to see. Let's see how we can figure out what went wrong. So usually what I like to do, I like to start with my debug statement. And I see that we got all the way to line 76. But we can already see here that we have this last modified date and then null from null, where null like direct. So we know that when we constructed our select statement, we had some null values that are screwing us over here. So let's look at the first thing. The first one is the field we selected. Oh, wait a second. Didn't we just make that selected object null? We just made it null, and for that reason, we are now getting from null. So what I'll do is I'll just move this section to before the time where I set it as a count. So now first we run the test for the null, and we should run that line 20, whatever it was, this section. And then we'll set it to a count and see what happens now. So let's try and run again. And we see again we got this unexpected token null. So let's look what happened now. Let's go back to my debug statement. Now I can see that I'm again querying from account this time, but the selected field is still null. Why is that? So if we look at our code here, we know that when the user makes a selection on a field, we put that field name into selected field variable. And then we use this map to get the API name. Right? We have that selected field API, which we use both here and here. Now what you may notice is that I hard-coded here type in the selected field. But when I look at the page, it doesn't actually say type, right? It says account type. The API name is type. So if I change this to account type, it will look in the map for account type and will return the API name type. Right now what happened, it looked for an account field with the label type, and it didn't find any. So it returned the null value. If I save this and run the test again.
It works. It works.
Our test now passes. Oh, mine didn't. Apparently I still broke something. Assertion failed. Expected 0, actual 5. So it says my assertion failed here. I still actually didn't get any. Why did this happen to me? Why does it always happen to me? I'm kidding. Let's see. Direct. We know that we insert. Let's look at the debug log. So we know that we inserted test account direct 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We know we inserted 3 channels. And then we create this statement when we say where type like direct. But for some reason we're getting 0 here. Type from account where type like direct. So what am I doing wrong here? Anybody has any idea?
Did you change the iterators when you were setting up the data? Are they still 6 and 4?
Did I change what?
Yeah, no, I see there in the user debug that you've got
I did
5
get
accounts.
8 to insert, but I don't. This was before the actual insert, right? The debug statement is happening right before the insert, but I am inserting them, and I'm starting my test. I'm assigning this, blah blah blah, null. Then we set it to account, and then we set the selected field to account type. Criteria to direct.
I'm actually getting it to work with minimal changes from the gist.
All you changed was this, right?
That, and I added the test for null object.
I'm obviously doing something pretty simply stupid. Let me try and run this again. Still getting 0. Now that is an odd one, I have to admit. Let's see. So usually I'll do this and then I'll get out of debug. Let's actually go back into debug here for a second. I'm going to go to where I inserted it. I want to see the insert operation, and it looks like I am inserting 8 accounts, and I don't see any problem with this. Looks like there's some other stuff that is running on this org. But it does look, I can see here, somebody else is debugging me on another test, but it doesn't matter because I can see type customer-direct. And then my select statement, select ID name from account with type like direct.
Now,
I obviously changed something very silly that is doing
you've
this.
You've got about 7 lines more than I do.
I have what? I'm sorry?
Just looking at the line numbers returned, it looks like you've added more than we had just straight out of the gist.
Yeah, I've added also this. I've added, where was that? I've added this system assert not equals, which I probably put a line before that, so that's 2 lines. And then I've added these 2 lines plus probably a space, so that's 5 lines. How many are in the gist? Let's look. It has 60 lines, and I have 68 probably in spaces. But let's try and do this. I'll just copy the gist. And we'll add our system assert here. Object names dot size. It's not equals to 0. We know that is good. Let's add the debug, the code for my null, which is basically going to be almost exactly as this. We'll change this to null. What's interesting is actually I don't even need to set it to null because we haven't set it to anything. So if I just call this statement, I should still get 1. And let's try and run it now. Actually change this to accounts type. Let's try and run it. I'm still getting this error. Must have changed something here. This is very weird. I will admit that I am a little stumped at this point. Jennifer says that hers passed. Let's try this again. This time I'll actually just leave it as is. I won't make any changes, except for that account type. Oops. Now let's try one more time. So that must mean I've done something on the class. But I'm very confused. String query, database query string.
It looks the same as what I have direct from the gist. For me, it's on line 67.
Yeah, what did I add here? I did add something, right? I added the to-do. Is the to-do on the gist?
Doesn't seem like
no, the to-do is not on the gist.
Okay, so it's just that.
So let me just copy that. We'll do that as well. I'll just save that so I have that Oh, there we go. So I'll save it here so I don't lose it. Copy this. And let's try this one more time. Okay, I am confused.
Well, let's see. Do you have any other executables in this org? Is there anything that could be?
I mean, there are some other things. You're right, that might be the case. What we can do to test this is, before we even do this, after the insert account, let's do list of accounts. Select ID name from account.
Looks like a good place for a system assert.
Oh, I should put here. So let's see what happens now if we actually can get these accounts. Because there might be something else. Because this is actually Bill's org. So I don't know if he created something that's blocking me from or deleting those. No, we are seeing them here. Yeah, every account you insert, it's delete. My wife is sending me a picture of my cat's foot, as you can see. Okay, so the accounts are inserted. And in fact, I can probably, if I remove the debug here, I can even see, well, I can't really because there's too many of them. But that's really it. They are created. Oh, you know what I wonder? I wonder if he's changing the account type. That might be the case. So let's do this.
Do you know that trick to use JSON to pretty print out all of the values from a query?
I don't. Sorry. Okay. Let's just debug a.name plus, I like to put a comma, plus a.type. I bet you this will shed some light on our of course. I need to query to be able to show it.
I also just sent a link to a really nifty trick.
Oh, Bill. Bill screwed us over. Okay, seems like Bill has a trigger on accounts. And I did notice that something running. So there's something really cool that you can see, by the way. I don't know if you know that. There's no way to edit always. But if I go here under any one of those, we can add some new columns to our list here. There's something called method. So you can see that when I insert them, something interesting is happening. We have an account insert, and here we have Apex trigger account type new, which I'm guessing is changing the account types from one to the other. And it says here, this type now is prospect. That explains everything. So that's why mine is failing. But I'm glad, Luke and Jennifer, that it worked for you. So that,
and it's also, it can be a little bit paranoid, but you can always test even just setting up your test data immediately after you put it in there. Run some system asserts to make sure that what you put in there is immediately still what you expect. I I don't do that in great detail, but this would definitely be a case where that type of paranoia would pay off.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the real lesson here, right, is when you work in an environment with other developers, or in an environment where other developers may have created code at some point, you never really know, you may never really know what they did. And so you could be creating code today and running the test, and it works perfectly, and tomorrow you're ready to deploy it, you run your test one more time, and now it's failing, and you beat your head against the wall. Why is it failing? I changed nothing. Or you changed one line that is not related, and now you're starting to recover your code. What changes did I make? Let me run those back, just like I did right now. I must have made a change that made it break. But the reality is, since I wrote this code last week and I tested this class, Bill went into this org and created a trigger that changes something on the account. The account type.
I think this falls under the category of problem solving that starts with, is the unit plugged in? Just go back and check those really basic things, like did the data go in the way I expected it to?
Yeah, and to be honest, I mean, in my company, I run everything, so I always know what people are creating, so I don't really encounter that a lot. But at the same time, when I instruct my developers to create something, I always make sure that they know what are the considerations. And if two people are working on two projects that are related in any way, interact with same objects, I will always make sure that they're aware of that. And of course, we have staff meetings where we all know what the others are working on at any given moment. So nobody really works in a vacuum, but that is just a perfect lesson that I didn't even mean to provide to you guys. So I'm hoping you gained something from it, but debugging skills, I always start from the top to the bottom, and by that I mean I always start with the immediate, where is the failure? If that doesn't give me the answer to what went wrong, I will start to say, okay, let me find out what was the data that came into this assert. Okay, let's find out what data I inserted. And if I know that I inserted data that the assert should be right, that means something in the middle changed that data. I mean, that's really the bottom line. Nothing else could have happened. So debugging is an art form by itself, and the more you do it, the more, of course, you'll get familiar with the tricks and the pitfalls of doing that. Personally, I really love it because it's kind of like detective work, especially when it's complicated. When one of my developers comes to me and says, I'm having this issue and I cannot figure out why it's happening, and we'll spend, 2 hours finding that a comma was in the wrong place. It's really annoying, at the same time very satisfying that you were able to find it. But I may be special in that sense that I enjoy it. Okay. So with that, we're actually very close to the end of the hour. So we'll do a couple of things before I set you off to the rest of your evening. We are going to start working on adding more and more functionality. So the next probably 2-3 sessions will continue adding now functionality to these classes and these pages. And so the first thing that I'll do is, let me bring back my original test class with my to-dos. That wasn't the test, that was the controller, sorry. And I'll save that. And I'll share this to-do list with you. But what I would like you to explore between this time and the next session, which will probably be in 2 weeks, first of all, you'll see that there's one more to do. Right now I'm checking that I got 5 results with direct. Let's now also test how many I'm getting for channel. And finally, how many I'm getting for all customers. So just add that class. Now again, this is actually not something that is going to necessarily increase your code coverage, because I think that by now you should have close to 90-something%. Look, what code coverage do you have?
97.
Okay. 97, because you covered almost every single line of the class. So this is something that I actually just had a conversation with my junior developer at work this week. She created a test class that provided a coverage, and I said, okay, that's great, let's review it. And of course, when we went to the test class, she did actually go through all of the code coverage. She got also to around 90-something%, but she didn't actually test anything that the class was doing. So it's great you can provide test coverage. And to be honest, when every young developer, or at least for me and for every developer that I've ever worked with, when you're a new developer, test classes many times are an annoyance. I just spent a week writing this class. It works. I just want to get it into production. Why do I need to write test class for this now? And, you know, even when I was a new developer, the first thing that I cared about was just how can I get this into production. So when I wrote a test class, my sole purpose for the test class was to get code coverage. But as Luke loves to say, and Luke is probably one of the people that loves, from everybody that I know in the Salesforce world, he is probably the person that loves test classes the most. And correct me if I'm wrong, Luke. But really, test classes have a very real purpose. And you really want to make sure that your class does what it's supposed to do. Because just getting the code coverage doesn't mean that it actually works. It just means that all of your code executes. And when sometimes you may make changes in other classes, just like we did now, if we didn't do the system assert, even without the system assert statement, you would have gotten the 97% coverage because you ran the button perform query. But without that assert, it would not fail, and we would not know that something is wrong. Now, in this case, of course, it's something that Bill did. I may not know. I may not care because this is not my org. But in reality, a lot of times, if you don't test that your classes perform as you expect, this may eventually lead to issues down the line. And one other thing to keep in mind is that when Salesforce creates the releases, the annual releases, the winter, spring, and so on, what they will do is they will actually run 100% of your test classes in every single customer org. And they will look to find problems. And of course, I mean, I can tell you that in 7 years that I've been developing the platform, I've never had Salesforce reach out to me and say, hey, there's a problem with your code that we found during testing or something like that. Most people don't even know that it happens. But the reality is that if they created some new functionality that broke something that you are using, if your test class is testing for it and it's now not working anymore, they will know it. You will probably not even be reached. They will find out, oh wait, we broke something. They'll fix it, and that all happens throughout the development cycle. So way before it even comes to your sandbox. Way before it even comes to your sandbox as a release. So the test classes really serve a lot of different purposes. One is, of course, to know that your code is working. The other is to provide test coverage. A third one is to make sure that as you release more changes, you know when you can test that nothing else broke. And the fourth one is what I just said. Salesforce actually uses this internally to make sure that they don't break any user's functionality. And with that, the last thing that I will say, so this time this is the first session that I'm actually going to give you homework for the next session. First of all, do this to do. Test the channel customers and all customers and make sure you get the number of results that you expect. And the next thing that I'd like you to do is to try and start tackling some of this to do. Specifically, the first, and if you feel adventurous, you can venture into the second and the third. But really, I want to try to get you guys to think about how can I make sure that if a user selected a field that I'm already querying, how do I make sure that I don't add that twice into my select statement and avoid that duplicate error that we got before? And so next session in 2 weeks, my expectation is that we'll be able to cover at the very least the first 3 to-dos items.
So do you think that first to-do item has that maps are going to be what will help us to solve that?
You can absolutely use maps. Yeah. You can also just create a set of fields. And just the fields that I right now hard-coded here, you can automatically just add them to the set. And then when you try to add, I mean, I'm already giving you kind of the solution, but that would work, right? Making sure that you don't have repeating values. But then you actually have to be very different in how you create this query string. You have to build this query string using a loop.
Ah.
So it gets interesting.
That's some good pseudocode for us to work to chew on there as we try and do it. So,
yep.
So sets to sort of enforce uniqueness, and then a loop to pull in the values from those sets. Exactly.
So if you feel, I mean, I would absolutely encourage you to try to do the first to-do. If you feel a little bit more adventurous, get to the second one. We will definitely cover the first two to-dos items. And if we're lucky and we go quickly, we can get maybe even to the third. And with that, any other questions? I will share this to-do list with you guys so you have that. And of course, the code is always available. We'll get you the recording. Will be shared on YouTube tomorrow on our YouTube channel. And if you have any kind of feedback, please feel free to reach out to us. If there's nothing else, I will bid you adieu. And one more quick note. If you are New York City local, we do have our developer user group meetup this Thursday at Silverline. So if you're not aware you are living in a cave, go to meetup, register, and show up. And with that, good night, everybody.
Good night.
Bye, Luke.